By the autumn of 1947, the cabinet had to make a decision. Economic crisis had forced Attlee once again to go cap in hand to America. The UN Special Committee had recommended that the British should go, leaving Palestine partitioned into a Jewish and an Arab state. Bevin said partition would mean war, and warned the UN that Britain would have no part in it. But at the General Assembly in November, the Zionists and the Americans used strong-arm tactics to win votes.
We were working very hard under the direct personal instruction of President Truman to get a successful vote on that. We used all the persuasion we could with delegates in New York. We went to many capitals bilaterally to try to get their governments to be sure that they had the instructions to work with us on this matter.
So in the meantime, pressure was brought on the states, on the capitals, and telephones from the Zionists and from Truman to the capitals, to heads of states. Commands came to the members to change their vote. And some of them, like Romulo, had to run away because he was threatened by the Zionists. Haiti's representative began to cry when he was forced to change his vote. Belt of Cuba resigned as ambassador to Washington and to the United States, resigned rather than vote for partition. So Cuba appointed somebody else to vote for partition. The cleanliness of the case was destroyed. It was no more a clean business. You are British, you appreciate sportsmanship and being a clean game. It was no more a clean game. And I said that in the United Nations in 1947. I said the United Nations General Assembly has no jurisdiction and no right to partition a country against the wishes of the inhabitants.
The vote to partition Palestine would in the event mean war, for the Palestinians to defend their country, for the Jews to win a state.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair. 2 days later, this was the typical scene. Arabs advancing on the center of Jerusalem at the beginning of a 3-day strike and an orgy of wrecking, looting, and bloodshed.
As Jews retaliated and the chaos spread, so began the most extraordinary 6 months of British colonial rule anywhere. Britain announced it would quit, in its own good time. Meanwhile, the British would do nothing but protect their own backs while the slow process of evacuation began. They would not maintain law and order, nor would they implement the United Nations plan to set up a Jewish and an Arab state. Nor would they let in the UN officials to do so themselves. For Bevin, this was the only honorable course.
We said, all right, the United Nations has a plan. We're not going to oppose it, but we don't think it'll work. It'll cause too much trouble with Arabs and Jews, and we are not going to take responsibility of executing it.
If we try to impose partition, we would at once alienate the Arabs and probably start a war with them. The Arabs would then possibly gravitate to be friends with the Russians, and we would be involved in a futile war fighting Arabs who were our friends on behalf of Jews who you could hardly say were our friends at the time.
At the United Nations, the colonial secretary brushed aside the protests.
British public opinion will permit no more expenditure of life and treasure. It will acquiesce no longer in the use of British forces and the squandering of British lives to impose a policy in Palestine which one or other of the parties is determined to resist.
We had a feeling at that time that, I would say, to give them the benefit of the doubt, that they didn't care damn what's going to happen, and if the Arabs will conquer the Arab Legion, all right, let them.
That doesn't interfere at all, the British administration. Never interferes in that. It's not their business. It's finished. You Jews and Arabs, deal with yourselves. Do what you want.
In the growing anarchy, the UN partition plan didn't stand a chance. the proposed Jewish state would contain hundreds of thousands of Arabs. The area allocated to the Palestinians was claimed by many Zionists as theirs by right. Both sides claimed Jerusalem as their sacred city and rejected the plan to make it international. In the vacuum created by the British, the issue was to be settled by the gun. Jewish forces were well prepared. They now trained openly for war. They'd set up a government for Jewish areas. The commanders saw no reason to keep within the UN boundaries. The Arabs, after all, had rejected them first.
They made their major mistake. If they would have accepted at that time the resolution, the Jewish state would have been perhaps as based on the United Nations resolution based on the partition. Once they broke the rules of the game, then there was no game.
We were fighting to live. We were fighting to stay in our houses. We know that the Zionist aims is to shift us all, to exert us all from old Palestine. We want to stay in our homes. Therefore, we fight for our children, for our land.
No one was well trained. The Jews were well trained because they knew what they were planning for. But we did not know what we were planning for because of our beloved leaders at that time.
The Palestinian leaders had been in exile and military activity suppressed. Now, villagers and groups of irregulars began training themselves, acquiring weapons where they could.
The best way to prevent the Zionists from attacking our villages is to try to cut their communications. Therefore, we attacked the convoys, and believe me, all the convoys we attacked were in armored cars, buses and trucks, and they were all armored cars from the steel the British troops provided for the Jews.
It was the convoys supplying the Jews in Jerusalem that the Palestinians hit the hardest. There were many casualties. The wrecks have since been made into monuments.
We blame the British for not keeping law and order. That was their role until the final evacuation of Palestine, and especially keeping alive the road to Jerusalem, keeping free the road to Jerusalem. On the other side, they were really blessed not to intervene, and we were happy about that because it let us rather overcome the Arabs and do whatever we wanted in order to help Jerusalem to survive.
With the British keeping their distance, the Haganah defeated the Palestinian irregulars here at El Castel, dominating the Jerusalem road. It was part of a military offensive to secure the Jewish state. Gaining territory, preferably without its Arab inhabitants, was a welcome byproduct for the Jewish agency. For the Irgun, with whom they had an alliance, it was the main aim.
We had a plan that while we couldn't force the Jewish agency to go back on its agreement to the partition scheme, we as dissidents, and we didn't mind what they called us, thugs or terrorists or whatever, would go beyond these boundaries, win the battles as we hoped, and then hand over the territory as such to the Haganah to look after.
Jerusalem was one area in which there was a cooperation between the Irgun and the Haganah, and the commander of Jerusalem was giving latitude that according to the interest and according to his forces to cooperate with the Irgun.